when life gives you lemons? Everyone knows how that ends. You make lemonade. It's cliche, but you understand the meaning of that saying. Lemons are sour. So, if life is sour and unpleasant, you take the sourness and you squeeze it and you add sugar and you make the most of the situation. That is another way to put it. What's interesting is that it's not just something we can do. What we find in Scripture is that that's something that God does very often, making the most of bad circumstances. Actually, if you think of any narrative that may rank among your favorites in scriptural history, probably that's exactly what's happening. Lemons being turned into lemonade. Maybe you are a fan of the story of Joseph. That is one of the best examples because Joseph's circumstances were not the kind of circumstances you want. Betrayed by his family, spared death only to be enslaved, and then freed, and then imprisoned again, and then forgotten. You want that for your life? No. You pray that that won't happen. But what's amazing is God uses those lemons to save the whole ancient world so they don't starve in time of famine, putting Joseph right where he needed to be. It couldn't have happened otherwise. Maybe you like the story of Daniel in Babylon, his courage as we're reading this, his courage. That was a bad situation. You have to remember that. Bad. His country was destroyed. He was taken away, far away. They speak a different language. It's a new culture. And then even there, he will not bow before the idol, and his friends, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, specifically, are thrown into a fiery furnace. You don't wake up hoping that's how your day will go. What's amazing is in all these cases, the reason you like those stories is because of the lemons. You like them because they were bad circumstances. The only time you don't like a story of God taking lemons and making lemonade is in your own case, because you don't see the lemonade yet. But you can be confident, if this is what he's always done, that this is what he's doing. Amazingly, as we see God do this in our lives and in Scripture through all history, there is a sense, it's not identical, but there's a sense in which you and I, as his people, are called to imitate him. Now, there are some things God can use that you can't use. But the fact that God makes the best of bad situations, that's what Christians are called to do. And our confidence is actually because we know he's doing it. Therefore, we are confident that we can do it. I want you to know, brothers, writes Paul, that what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel. Wow, what happened to Paul? He was probably given a huge chunk of change to fund him as he did missions in the ancient world. No. He was chained. He was arrested, and he was put on arrest. He was chained to guards, and he says, I want you to know that these lemons, I'm turning them into lemonade. Because he was chained to a guard with whom he shared the gospel, who came to Christ, and now the gospel is reaching into the higher echelons of Rome through the guards. This is something you and I are called to do. As believers, it is easy to look at the world and see how bad things are and how bad things are getting and how bad things probably will get. Well, there's some wisdom in observing that. You can't just stay there. The next question immediately is, how do we glorify God in the situation in which we find ourselves? Can't change the situation always, but you can choose to make the best of the situation, to glorify God rather than bemoaning what you wish was. We can glorify God right where we are. I say this because David in our text today, that's what he's doing. That's what God's doing in his life, and that's what David is doing in imitation of God. Remember that David has always had lemons. He's been pursued by Saul, who's been trying to kill him unjustly because Saul is paranoid that David's trying to take the throne. Really, God was taking the throne to give to David. Saul has pursued David for a long time now. It's made David's life a living nightmare. He's hiding away with 600, a group of a ragtag bunch. Everything has been bad for him, and yet it's through this experience that David can write words that we now all take comfort in. Psalm 23:5. He says to God, "You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies." Let's see that happen now as David goes from one enemy into the heart of a land full of other enemies. 1 Samuel 27, starting in the first verse. Then David said in his heart, that means he was thinking this, "Now I shall perish one day by the hand of Saul. There's nothing better for me than that I should escape to the land of the Philistines. Then Saul will despair of seeking me any longer within the borders of Israel, and I shall escape out of his hand." So David arose and went over, he and the 600 men who were with him, to Achish, the son of Maoch, king of Gath. And David lived with Achish at Gath, he and his men, every man with his household, and David with his 2 wives, Ahinoam of Jezreel, and Abigail of Carmel, Nabal's widow, whom we saw previously. And when it was told Saul that David had fled to Gath, he no longer sought him. Then David said to Achish, "If I've found favor in your eyes, let a place be given me in one of the country towns that I may dwell there. For why should your servant dwell in the royal city with you?" So that day Achish gave him Ziklag. Therefore Ziklag has belonged to the kings of Judah to this day. And the number of the days that David lived in the country of the Philistines was 1 year and 4 months. Now David and his men went up and made raids against the Geshurites, the Girzites, and the Amalekites, for these were the inhabitants of the land from of old, as far as Shur to the land of Egypt. And David would strike the land and would leave neither man nor woman alive, but would take away the sheep, the oxen, the donkeys, the camels, and the garments, and come back to Achish. When Achish asked, "Where have you made a raid today?" David would say, "Against the Negeb of Judah," or "against the Negeb of the Jerahmeelites," or "against the Negeb of the Kenites." And David would leave neither man nor woman alive to bring news to Gath, thinking, lest they should tell about us and say, "So David has done." Such was his custom all the while he lived in the country of the Philistines. And Achish trusted David, thinking, "He's made himself an utter stench to his people Israel. Therefore he shall always be my servant." In those days, the Philistines gathered their forces for war to fight against Israel. And Achish said to David, "Understand that you and your men are to go out with me in the army." David said to Achish, "Very well, you shall know what your servant can do." And Achish said to David, "Very well, I'll make you my bodyguard for life." You might at first think that David is saved. He's been chased by Saul for so long, and we read in verse 4, "And when it was told Saul that David had fled to Gath, he no longer sought him." Only he's not. The problem is that David has gone from one enemy into a land full of more enemies. The Philistines are not David's friends. They're not friends to Yahweh. They're not friends to Yahweh's people. They worship false gods. They fight against God's people. Even at the start of chapter 28, there is a renewed campaign against the Israelites. This is not friendly territory. This is not a good situation. It is kind of a horizontal move, really, from what he was experiencing in Israel. And David is to spend 16 months in the land of his enemies. It's really remarkable, actually, that he's there so long. It's remarkable, on the one hand, that he survived it. Again, these are his enemies. He goes to Gath. Remember, Gath is where Goliath is from. David killed Goliath. This is not a safe place for David. But what's even more remarkable is how much good came out of those 16 months. And that's what we're going to be looking at today, and we're going to take the famous line from Psalm 23 and begin with, "In the presence of my enemies," but that's where David is, but then move to, "You have prepared a table for me," or in the rougher, cruder analogy we've used, we're going to be talking about the lemons and then the lemonade. So let's begin with, "In the presence of my enemies." This is David in a bad situation, and you may find yourself similarly in a bad situation this day. Look again at these first 4 verses. "Then David said in his heart," here's the starting bad situation, "Now I shall perish one day by the hand of Saul. There's nothing better for me than that I should escape to the land of the Philistines." That's desperate. "Then Saul will despair of seeking me any longer within the borders of Israel, and I shall escape out of his hand." So David arose and went over, he and the 600 men who were with him, to Achish, the son of Maoch, king of Gath. And David lived with Achish at Gath, he and his men, every man with his household, and David with his 2 wives, Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail of Carmel, Nabal's widow. And when it was told Saul that David had fled to Gath, he no longer sought him. You may be thinking, Achish sounds familiar. He does. We encountered him, and David encountered him back in chapter 21, when David, running from Saul, left the land for the first time, made his way to Gath. At that point, he was alone, or mostly alone, and he tried to hide in Gath, but he was recognized by the servants of Achish, who brought him to the king, and David had to act insane to escape. You remember that? He let spit go on his beard, and he scrawled on the gate, and Achish said, "I've got enough crazy people in this town," and drove David away. Now, there is some possibility that Achish is more an official title of a ruler there in Gath, just like Pharaoh is the title of the ruler in Egypt, so you have a lot of pharaohs. That is possible, in which case this Achish could be a different Achish than the one encountered in chapter 21, or he might be the very same one. And you might be wondering, how did David talk his way out of that? Thought you were crazy. How does he talk his way out of that? I don't know. David's pretty cunning. Maybe this Achish, if he is the same man, respected the cunning of David. I have no idea. Whatever the case is, this is a much friendlier welcome than he received formerly. It's different, too, because he's bringing a lot of people with him. The fact remains that David did go to Gath. This is one of the 5 great cities, the Pentapolis of the Philistines, the one that would have been closest to where David was, hometown of Goliath. And now, for a second time, David is there. He's warmly received, but he is, don't forget, among his enemies, in the presence of his enemies. Now, I've said that this circumstance is not ideal, and that's true on a number of levels. It's true in the sense of the leaving of Israel itself. I will be honest and just tell you, in studying this passage, I don't know if it was right or wrong of David to run away to Gath. I don't know. I mean, on the one hand, Yahweh had promised to David, by having Samuel anoint him, that David really would be the next king. A prerequisite of being the king is you can't be dead. And so David, if he was operating in faith, you think he would assume, I can't die here. God's protected me from Saul thus far. He will keep protecting me. You don't see that kind of faith operating, to my knowledge, in what David says in verse 1. Now I shall perish one day by the hand of Saul. There's nothing better for me than that I should escape to the land of the Philistines. I mean, it seems it'd be better if God just kept doing what he'd been doing and delivering him. What may be happening here is that David is just tired of running away. And it is easy for you and I, in this nice air-conditioned room, to pass our judgments on David. But if anyone here, and some of you have been in circumstances where your fight or flight mechanism has frequently been aroused, that adrenaline pumping and then back down, and then pumping again. That's what David was living. We might die, we won't die. We could die, we won't die. If you've been in a circumstance like that, you know how exhausting physically and mentally that can be. And it might be that David is just tired of that. David also, of course, now has family to think about. That does change the equation a little bit. See that in verse 3. And David lived with Achish at Gath, he and his men, every man with his household. That's wives and children. And David with his 2 wives, Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail of Carmel, Nabal's widow. When David had returned the first time after leaving the country, in chapter 22, it was actually the prophet Gad who had come, sent by the Lord, to tell David, go back to Judah. But see, we don't know if that was a standing order. Was that God's will perpetually, that you stay in Judah or not? I don't know. It doesn't tell us. So I'm not entirely sure if this was David in a lapse of faith, running away when he should have stayed, or, on the other hand, taking an exit that was permitted by God. I don't know. But the very least of what we can say is this was not ideal. These were not the circumstances that even David wanted. In fact, just last chapter, he had made that clear. When he had told Saul, if there are these men convincing you to persecute me, he said, they have driven me out this day that I should have no share in the heritage of the Lord. He means the land. Saying, go serve other gods. That's the danger of going to Philistia. And then David added, now therefore, let not my blood fall to the earth away from the presence of the Lord. David knows it is not ideal to be away from the land of Israel. So the leaving is a bad situation. And as you and I read this passage, if we're honest with ourselves, the lying is a very uncomfortable part of this situation too, isn't it? Achish probably welcomes David in this time, as opposed to last time, because at this point he's probably aware there is a huge rift between Saul, king of Israel, Philistia's enemy, and David, who had been in the royal households, now on the run. Achish probably thinks David is leading a faction against Saul, and the enemy of my enemy is my friend. This would put Philistia and Gath in a good position to support this quote-unquote faction over against the king of Israel. So this is not some friendly intention he has for Israel. This is actually against Israel. This is supporting what he would consider probably a coup. David wants Achish to keep thinking that, it seems, right? It's part of why in verse 5, David's request is to go away from Gath. He says, if I found favor in your eyes, let a place be given me in one of the country towns, that I may dwell there. For why should your servant dwell in the royal city with you? That is almost certainly a kind of false humility on David. I don't deserve to be in the city with you. But really, David just wants to be out of Achish's sight. He doesn't want Achish to see what he's doing. And we learn why that is right afterward. Because once he and his men go down to Ziklag, that's far south, away from both Saul and Gath. Once he's down there out of sight, he starts making raids on the Geshurites, the Girzites, and the Amalekites, Canaanites in the land. Now, this is interesting because that probably would not have upset Achish, because those groups were also enemies of Philistia. They would come in, raid the land, and so probably Achish would have no problem with David making raids on them. But the reason David wanted to be far away and left no one to tell Achish what he was doing is because he wanted to mislead Achish into thinking that he was not fighting against their common enemy, the Canaanites in the south. He wanted Achish to think that he was fighting Israel, to support Achish's assumption that he's a faction fighting against Saul. You see this in verse 10. When Achish asked, where have you made a raid today? David would say, a lie, against the Negeb, that's the southern part of Judah, or against the Negeb of the Jerahmeelites, those are allies of Judah, or against the Negeb of the Kenites, another group of allies of Judah. David is lying. He's lying. I don't know how else to put that. That's what's happening here. And it works because verse 12, and Achish trusted David, thinking, He has made himself an utter stench to his people Israel. Therefore he shall always be my servant. We've talked about the lying that happens in the Old Testament, especially in a time of warfare before. And we've said that not all kinds of deceit. There are good believers who disagree with me on this, and we can love each other. That's totally fine. I love truth. I do love truth, right? So, in almost every single case in your life ever, don't lie. In a time of war, there is espionage that takes place. There are ambushes that happen. There are forms of deceit. Rules are a little different there. So it's hard even here, just like the leaving, it's a little difficult to judge. How does God view what David is doing here? What we can tell, regardless, is that this deceit, this cunningness on David's part, works really well until it doesn't. Which I think is the point of the beginning of chapter 28. That appears to be David's lies catching up with him. It's one thing for him to be far away down in Ziklag, out of the reach and the sight of Achish, claiming to fight Israel. And now Achish, fully deceived, assumes, yes, of course. Why don't you just keep doing that, but now do it with me in battle against Israel? That puts David in a bind. If he refuses, the ruse is up. If he obeys, he's fighting the Lord's anointed and the Lord's people. So the leaving and the lying make us quite uncomfortable, at the very least. That's why David gives that response in 28. Very well, you shall know what your servant can do. That's very vague. He doesn't say what he'll do. He just says, you'll know what I can do. I think he's trying to be vague there. We will come back to that story after the next chapter. The leaving, the lying, living among his enemies. Is this a good situation? Is this where you want to be? Is this where David wants to be? No. No. These are the lemons. He is in the presence of his enemies, trying to survive. That's what makes it remarkable when we turn now to the second part of this passage. The fact that in the presence of his enemies, God prepares a table. God makes lemonade, if you will. It is a kindness of the Lord that, just like verse 4 says, when it was told Saul that David had fled to Gath, he no longer sought him. I don't want to neglect that. I don't want to make little of that. If you were David, that'd be great to read about yourself. That would be fantastic that Saul no longer sought him. So that really is a kindness of the Lord. Regardless, should David have done it or not, I don't know. It was a kindness of the Lord. He got a bit of a reprieve from Saul. But what's more important, the prepared table, if you will, in this passage is the land that David began to win for Israel. It happens right here. He's not even king yet. This is where he begins, as far as we know, to win land for Israel. You see that, first of all, in verse 6, so that day Achish gave him Ziklag, therefore Ziklag has belonged to the kings of Judah, it's David's descendants, to this day. Now, in reading this passage, you have to bear in mind, this is not like today. You can't make direct comparisons to what's happening politically today. Don't do it directly. It doesn't work. We're under a new covenant. But you have to bear in mind that under this covenant, at this time, God had specifically commanded his people under Joshua that they were to go into the land of Canaan, which God was giving them, and wipe everyone out. And that seems harsh at first, of course, but the reason in God's mind, one of the reasons was if they didn't, Israel would become idolaters. And guess what? God was right. Can you believe it? And so they left people that they didn't drive out, and it tempted them to idolatry. The command given long before through Moses here in Deuteronomy 20 went, in the cities of these peoples that the Lord your God is giving you for an inheritance, you shall save alive nothing that breathes, but you shall devote them to complete destruction. The Hittites and the Amorites, the Canaanites and the Perizzites, the Hivites and the Jebusites, that's a representative list, we could include the Geshurites, the Girzites, the Amalekites. As the Lord your God has commanded, that they may not teach you to do according to all their abominable practices that they've done for their gods, and so you sin against the Lord your God. The Philistines should not have been in the land to begin with, because it was the role of Joshua and his generation to defeat them. And if they had acted in perfect faith, they would have, but they didn't. So the Philistines remained. And the groups that are named there in the south, the Geshurites, the Girzites, the Amalekites, these too should not have been in the land. It was God's command that they not be there. Their presence in the land, Philistia and these southern groups, their presence in the land was an ongoing reminder of Israel's failure and disobedience. And when you see it in that light, what you realize is what David is doing, it is bringing to completion the task that was left unfinished by previous generations. It is actually in obedience to the command of God that former generations had not obeyed. Even Saul had failed. You notice that one of the groups mentioned there are the Amalekites. That's why Saul was losing the kingdom. Because when God said, go wipe out the Amalekites, he didn't. David now obeys. This is what we can see in verse 8 when we get to the raids of David. Now David and his men went up and made raids against the Geshurites, the Girzites, and the Amalekites, for these were the inhabitants of the land from of old. But see, they shouldn't have been. They shouldn't have remained the inhabitants as far as Shur to the land of Egypt. That is land God promised to his people down in the south. Even under Saul, these should have been driven out and were not. And now David begins what will be a long task, even after he becomes king, of bringing the land that should have belonged to Israel at that time under Israel's control. So verse 11, again, this is the one that sounds very harsh in our passage at first. And David would leave neither man nor woman alive to bring news to Gath. David's motivation is he doesn't want Achish to know what he's doing. That's why he wipes everyone out. But at the same time, he is obeying the command that was given before. He is wiping everyone out. Oh, thank you. Thanks for that. He is wiping everyone out just as God had previously commanded. You have to bear that in mind in this passage. Now, you and I, at this point, we are so used to seeing God make use of bad situations to accomplish his task. We see that all the time, all the way through the Bible. It's not a surprise to us that even this horrible situation is used by God to accomplish his purposes. But what's amazing in this passage is that we see God's people, David, imitating Yahweh on just this point. David is a scrapper. He is making the best of a very bad situation. I think it would have been easy for David and his men to go down to Ziklag, far away from Achish and Saul, and just mope. You've been there. Life is hard, and then it gets harder, and then it gets harder on top of the harder, and at some point you just go, look, we're just going to survive this season of our life. We're not making any gospel advances. We're not trying to give more. We're not trying to evangelize more. We're not trying to get involved in service opportunities or relationships, because those have burned before. We are just surviving this really hard situation, and when God makes our circumstances easier, then we serve the Lord. Stop thinking that. That's wrong. That is a wrong thing to think. Listen, if you're part of God's people, don't assume that the circumstances ever get easier. It's not to be discouraging, but just realistically, God's people have proven their faithfulness, and God has proven his faithfulness by what he enables his people to accomplish in the worst circumstances, not in the ideal circumstances. David is making lemonade out of the lemons of providence, because that's what God does. That's what David is doing. He is taking initiative. He's doing what he can. You may disagree with his method on some of these points. There's question there. The fact is, he's doing something. He is active. He doesn't say to his men, well, this is a real low point, guys. We are far from home. It's not even clear that coming here was the right decision in the first place. Let's just wait this out, and when the tide is better and the wind is stronger, we set sail in faith. But that's not how faith works. Faith sets sail when the wind's against you. Ephesians 5 says, look carefully then how you walk, not as unwise but as wise, making the best use of the time, taking those opportunities, because the days are evil. You see the logic there? Same as our passage. It's not waiting till the days are good and then using those opportunities. David took advantage of his disadvantages. That's what faith does. That's what we do as followers of Jesus Christ. We make the best use of our time because the days are evil. We don't bury the coin in the handkerchief safely, worrying that things are so rough culturally and the future, and where in your own life, trials so difficult, don't know how it's going to turn out, so let's bury that gift God's given us, put it safely in the earth until better times come. Don't do that. No. Today is the day to serve. Today is the day to share the gospel of Jesus Christ. Today is the day to build healthy relationships and fellowship with God's people and to love them. Today's the day to discipline your children and raise them in the fear and the nurture of the Lord. It's today. It's not tomorrow. Say, today's so rough. Okay, but those are the lemons. That's the providence you've got. If you're in Ziklag with David, then be active. Make raids. That's what he does here. Did Christ ever have an ideal circumstance while on earth? Ever. There in Nazareth, a carpenter, poor, grows up. His friends, at the end of his life, they abandon him. He's got all kinds of religious enemies. He develops political enemies. He is betrayed. He is crushed by Rome. He is crucified on the side of the road. Is any of that ideal? But God takes that, squeezes it, and out comes salvation for the world. And Christ's followers thereafter, they were crushed by Rome into a fine powder that caught on fire and took over the Roman Empire. We Christians, we live, we thrive in the unhealthiest of places, in the dregs of society, in the lowest places. That's what makes us unique, is that we're not waiting for the winds to be in our favor. We hope they would be, but they may never be. But we proceed forward on faith. We share the gospel of Jesus Christ with others. You can do that, and sometimes even better, in bad circumstances. Even if your country's going a way you don't like, you can do that. You can thrive. You can move forward, advancing the gospel, serving others, glorifying God. And what you will find as you proceed in faith is that even if you find yourself in the presence of your enemies, there will be a rich table prepared before you. Let's pray.